much for joining me today. We are continuing our journey through Daniel, and we're going to be taking a look at Daniel 6 this week. Let's pray as we get started. Oh God, we come to you today, and we thank you for today. Another day to be able to open your word and study it together, God. I pray that you will transform us and form us as we read your word and just speak to our hearts. We love you and pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. So Daniel 6, we have made it all the way to Daniel 6. And if I'm completely honest, Daniel 5 and 6 are like two of my favorite stories in the whole book of Daniel. I just love the story of Daniel and the lions and the den of lions. And I've read it over and over again since I was a kid. And it's always fascinated me and moved me in so many different ways. And of course, it's my thoughts and my experience and how it's moved me has changed as I have gotten older. But still, just the wonder of God protecting Daniel from the mouths of those lions is just amazing. And I love it. So I'm excited to talk about this chapter today. So we left things last week with Nebuchadnezzar coming to understand who God was and his relationship to God. We touched a little bit on chapter 5 with King Belshazzar and just how much different he was from King Nebuchadnezzar. But what we see coming through Daniel 5 and into chapter 6 is we see the collapse of the Babylonian Empire. And yet Daniel still is able to serve and transcends those empire shifts, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. He's able to go from serving very closely the king of Babylon through some successive kings in Babylon and is able to rise through the ranks in the Persian Empire and serve there as well. And we know from Daniel 1 that he will serve all the way into the reign of King Cyrus, who will send all of the conquered peoples back to their land, allowing the exiles to return to Jerusalem. But we're not there yet. First, we have Daniel 6. So Belshazzar is killed at the end of chapter 5, and we are told that Darius the Mede takes over the kingdom of Babylon, and then that is who Daniel is interacting with in chapter 6. So at this point in Daniel has become a very old man. The days of his early service to King Nebuchadnezzar and being trained and all of that was 50 plus years previous. And so he is very old at this point, and he has had a long tenure of serving in the halls of these pagan kings. So the way we're going to talk through this chapter is we're going to read it in some different chunks and we're going to talk about them. So let's go ahead and start things off right here. And we're going to read in Daniel 6, and we're going to read the first 4 verses. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them, so that the king might not suffer loss. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for the charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him, because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. And so we see here, again, Daniel is rising to the top. He is chosen as one of 3 administrators, and then his excellence and his who he is able to distinguish himself to the point where the king is planning to set him over all of the kingdom. And so he's going to be promoted again, and he'll be over all of these other dudes. And we get the sense that Daniel just did everything with excellence and saw he was exceptional. He was outstanding. And we get the sense that this was not just some chance or luck, or the king wasn't just playing favorites, but Daniel had possessed qualities and did the hard work that allowed him to rise to the forefront. His excellence outshone everybody else. So not only was he really good at his job, but he also had integrity. And we were told that he's trustworthy, so the king could trust him, and that he also was not negligent. So he carried out everything he was supposed to do with a thoroughness and an attention to detail, and did everything that he could to do it to the best of his ability. And he wasn't corrupt. He couldn't be bought. He couldn't be bribed. And there was nothing that could be found to be a fault in him. One of the things that that Christopher Wright, the commentator I was reading this week, he pointed out that Daniel was working in a secular pagan kingdom, and he was maintaining his integrity, he was maintaining his excellence, and just doing everything he could to work so hard, and so it was outstanding. And he was rising to the front. He was being noticed in the way he did things, but not because he was just awesome, but it was because of the way he was going about it. Daniel very much saw himself as serving God and doing his very secular job of serving the king. And this commentator, Christopher Wright, pointed out, and I agree with him, that as followers of Jesus, we should seek to follow Daniel's example. The world should be able to notice that there's something different about us. We should work hard and with excellence at everything we do, as if we are doing it for God, because we are. Even if it's a secular job and it's has nothing to do with church or God in any overt way, we all follow Jesus, and we get to serve him through everything we do, and we should seek to have that kind of an attitude. I think that is one of the things that made Daniel so excellent and helped him maintain his integrity, and people noticed. And so let's look at those people who noticed here. And let's look at these other administrators and satraps, because they were not happy. So they've been trying to find, we saw in verse 4 that they were trying to find a way that he was corrupt, or that they could say, hey, he didn't do this right, or some other way they could trap him, but they couldn't. And so then let's read the next few verses, starting in verse 5. Finally, these men said, we will never find any basis for charges against this man, Daniel, unless it has something to do with the law of his God. And so they know that the only way they're going to be able to get at him is through something that really is a strength, his loyalty and devotion to God above all else. And we don't know how long they have known him. We don't know if some of these people may have served with him from the beginning. Some of them haven't. We don't know. We're not really told more than the fact that they really don't like him at this point. They seem so jealous of him and filled with so much spite or hatred for his success. And we're not really given enough to know why they were so frustrated or angry about it, but they were. And so they want to get at him. So let's keep reading, starting in verse 6. So these administrators and satraps went as a group to the king and said, may King Darius live forever. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered, in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. So King Darius put the decree in writing. So these guys were clever and cunning and conniving, and they found the only way they could get at Daniel was to attack him on the basis of his ethnicity and his religion. So he was a follower of the one true God, and he was a Jew. And those things were interconnected, right? Because it's not just a religion, it's not just an ethnicity, it's both. And so that was the only way they could get at him. And later on, they refer to him in verse 13, when they're talking to the king about him, they call him one of the exiles from Judah. Well, we're 50 plus years well removed from that. Darius was not even the one who was a part of the exile and exiling the Jews. And yet that's how he's being referred to. It's very interesting. And just I think it's just an important side note there. But they were attacking Daniel where he was strong. And Christopher Wright told, in his commentary that I was reading, made another interesting point just about the Persian Empire in general. A little bit later on, King Cyrus is going to issue an edict that allows the conquered peoples to return to their land. So the Persians handled conquered peoples differently than the Babylonians. The Babylonians would take over, like we saw they did with Judah. They took over, Jerusalem fell. They carted all the people off to Babylon. They also would take whatever idol of the conquered peoples. Well, the one true God doesn't have an idol. So Nebuchadnezzar took all of the sacred objects from the temple and carted those off to Babylon. So it's as a way of saying, we've got to take all the people. We've captured you. We've captured your God. Now we're in charge and we're taking you with us. And so that was how they handled conquered peoples. It was as if they had to keep them away and saying, hey, we win, in order to prevent rebellion. Well, the Persians took a different tact, and they would allow the various people groups to maintain their religion and maintain some of those things, and they were allowed to stay in their land. And so we will see Cyrus later on in Israel's history allow the people to return to Jerusalem. And who can see that, read that, part of that in Ezra 1 through 4. And it's just fascinating to think about. So this edict that King Darius is being in some ways tricked, but definitely flattered into doing, is not congruent completely with the way the Persians handled conquered people. Not that the people had tons and tons of freedoms, but it was definitely different than the way Babylon handled things. And so people were allowed to maintain a religious identity. But here we see something different. And we see these conniving administrators appealing to Darius's pride a little bit and kind of flattering him and stroking his ego a bit and saying, hey, everybody really should just worship you for 30 days. And that's what it should be. But let's look at how Daniel responds. So we're going to keep reading starting in verse 10. So this decree has been issued and put in writing and it can't be changed. And so let's start in verse 10 and let's see how Daniel responds. Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So we see Daniel respond with this same devotion that he has always had. And he prays. He goes to God. He prays anyway, even though in this instance, prayer has become a political statement. Before, it was just he was connecting with God and the way that he had probably done since he was a young person. And yet, even though it had become forbidden, he did it anyways. Which is interesting because it's different than his 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were required to do something that they couldn't do, worship the statue. Daniel was forbidden to do something that he always did, that he knew he needed to do. Which was pray. This is interesting. An interesting comparison. Both Daniel and his friends were presented with these impossible situations that they had to make a decision on how they were going to handle. And even though it would have been easier to just maybe pray in secret or change his way of doing things, he didn't. He knew that he still needed to pray. He still needed to do exactly what he always did. And so it says here that his windows were open toward Jerusalem and he would pray kind of towards Jerusalem. And I think that's something interesting because I was kind of always thought through where did this come from? And one of the commentators pointed out 1 Kings 8 in Solomon's prayer at the dedication of the temple. And I wanted to read 1 Kings 8 verses 48 and 49. This is so interesting because Solomon prays this and he says, and if they turn back to you, so he's talking about, okay, so we're going to start in verse 46. When they sin against you, and there's no one who does not sin, and you become angry with them and give them over to their enemies who take them captive, and if they have a change of heart in the land where they are held captive, and starting verse 48, and if they turn back to you with all their heart and soul in the land of their enemies who took them captive, and pray to you toward the land you gave their ancestors, toward the city you have chosen and the temple I have built for your name, then from heaven, your dwelling place, hear their prayer and their plea and uphold their cause. And so we have Solomon praying at the dedication of the temple. And so Daniel, in many ways, is just carrying out what he already knows in scripture. And it's so interesting. I never made that connection before. And I found it fascinating that it's like he's anticipating this situation. And so Daniel's doing that as a captive in a foreign land, praying towards Jerusalem, to the place where God dwells. You remember we talked in Ezekiel how God's presence left the temple and left the city. And then it returned at the end. God came back. So Jerusalem wasn't just a city. It was the place where God dwelled on earth. That's how the Jews would have seen it, is that is the place where God dwells. The temple is the place where God dwells. Jerusalem is the city where he dwells. And so turning towards Jerusalem is turning towards the place where God dwells. So 3 times a day, Daniel was turning towards Jerusalem and humbling himself in prayer, and almost as a way to align himself with God and God's purposes, or connecting with the God who dwells in Jerusalem, his God. And I think that is such an interesting point here. So not only was he praying, but he was doing it 3 times a day. And that devotion, that level of devotion, that level of constantly throughout his day, turning his heart to God and the things of God and God's purposes in the world. And that I found that very challenging and inspiring. At the same time as I was reading and studying this week, it was just how am I going about connecting with God throughout my day? Am I waking up in the morning and praying and that's good? Or am I focusing on God and connecting with him throughout the day? Am I setting aside other times? Or am I just kind of praying only in the morning? And I found that very very inspiring and challenging this week as I was examining my own life. So let's keep going then. So we see that they find Daniel at prayer, and he's specifically asking God for help. So Daniel's response in this hard situation is prayer, and to connect with God. So we see Daniel's response in this tough situation is to connect with God, just like he does all the time, every day. And so these men go to the king. So look in verse 12. They go to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone had praise to any god or human, except you, would be thrown into the lion's den? And the king answered, the decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. Then they said to the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. So Darius is just completely distraught, and in many ways was just trapped between a rock and a hard place. He knew Daniel was innocent and was trustworthy and was loyal to him as a king, but ultimately loyal to God. But he knew who Daniel was, and he was just distraught. he did not deserve to be thrown to the lions. So let's just kind of finish reading the story and then we'll talk about it. Then the men went as a group to King Darius and said to him, "Remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed." So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. And the king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve, continually been able to rescue you from the lions?" Daniel answered, "May the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I ever done anything wrong before you, your majesty." The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him because he had trusted in his God. At the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. And then King Darius wrote to all the nations and peoples of every language in all the earth, "May you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. I can just imagine how distraught Darius was in that night when he was waiting to find out if Daniel was in fact going to be rescued. We don't really get a whole lot from Daniel's point of view. We get the distress of King Darius, but we don't get any amount of what was Daniel thinking or feeling. And we know he was confident in God, just as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were. Confident in God's ability to deliver him. Whether or not he did not matter for Daniel to serve him. But he knew that God could, in fact, deliver. He had the ability to. And we see once again God showing a pagan king his power and how he is able to deliver. And it doesn't matter what is going on, that God is the king and is able to be, and God is sovereign over all. I love this picture of Daniel's trust in God. And I also love the picture of God's sovereignty and how even though the people were trapped in Babylon and in exile, that God was still present and still active and still at work. And his sovereignty was not limited to Jerusalem. His sovereignty is over the whole earth. And we see Darius at least acknowledging that in some way here at the very end. And acknowledging God's ability to rescue and to save and perform these wonderful signs and wonders. So we're going to keep going. We have a couple more weeks in our study of Daniel, and we're going to talk about some of these visions that are in the second part of the book, and that's going to start next week. So I hope you will join me. See you next week. Bye.